this video I'll be talking about some MIDI machines in MIDI Guitar 3. I'll be talking in particular about the looper, the arpeggiator, the shredder and the sequencer. And what these all have in common is that they are MIDI machines and they have some sort of relationship to the sync to beat or sync to time function that we have in MIDI Guitar 3. And what that is, I'll point out to begin with, and then I'll go into some examples with each of these MIDI machines as we go along in the video. When we're creating a patch for a particular project, say a song or something like that, we have an idea about a tempo in this song. Let's say I want to have that tempo at, say, 100 BPMs for a place to start. Now I want every instrument an effect, a pulsating effect if you have some delay. I want every drum machine to be recognizing that we're using 100 BPMs for this project. Instead of having to go into each and every one of these instruments and effects and set that locally, we're going to do this globally. So I set my project to 100 BPMs, and every effect and every instrument that knows how to handle this kind of time code information will recognize that this project is 100 BPMs. If you want some specific instrument or effect not follow this general time code, you need to go into that effect and click on something like follow host. That is probably used by default in most instruments. I have this play button here. This is to have a synchronized start of everything that can start in time with this 100 BPM setting. I can do that from here. I can also use my space bar on my keyboard. I can connect my expression pedal, for instance, directly to this button and control it with my expression pedal, which would be great for some live use, I believe. It's perhaps not the most efficient use of your expression pedal, since that's also connectable to this BPM setting. So if you want to have some live control over your tempo, you can absolutely connect your expression pedal to this, but perhaps you need to set some limits to the scope of the sweep. If I were to use my expression pedal this way, I would go in, use my software and perhaps set my minimum to something like 94 and the maximum to something relevant. But then you might want to use something else for your play button, and in that case I would use something like a sustain pedal, something that is just has this on and off function. An expression pedal for the BPMs and a sustain pedal for the synchronized start of everything. So let's start with a look at the new looper. 3 buttons, so it's really easy. We have a record button here, we have a enable playback button here, and we have an erase button here. Since this is both a recorder and a player, you need something that plays the contents of the recorded loop, and that's the transport play button up here. So click that, and as soon as you've recorded something and you want to play back, you'll of course click the playback button. If I have the playback enabled already from the beginning and just start recording, as soon as I let go of the expression pedal controlling the recording session here, it starts to play back whatever I have in the loop. So I can stop this locally, just muting this loop. It will still go on, but this is just a mute. Or I can stop the whole function of the transport, so to speak. Worth noting, anytime I've stopped the playback on the looper, everything I play will pass through this and go directly to the bass instrument. So I can still have this going, of course, still be able to play whatever I want to. Just activating the looper, I get whatever on the loop until I deactivate that and start playing again. This is the way to introduce the contents of the looper into the song or whatever you're playing. Obviously, we have any number of ways of setting these loopers up. You can use one per chain, and I've used a triple pedal so I can control the recording part of each and every one of these separately, like so. Another way to use this is, of course, to put two loopers on the same chain, but you might want to keep them separate by something like a pedal. And here's how you set that up. Use a modulator. Go in and use the invert function. You can go from your pedal directly to the invert handle here. Go from the invert connector to any of the looper player functions or playback functions, and go from the pedal directly to the other playback function. And this way, switching between the looper's content is as easy as pressing your pedal. Let's move over to the sequencer and take a look at that. The sequencer is very much a player like the looper is, but it's not a recorder. So in this case, we manually input any sort of MIDI that we want our instruments to play afterwards. You're going to have the transport playing in the background to have the sequencer playing back any sort of MIDI that you've recorded. You have two velocity layers. One click means that you get a soft dynamic, it's a velocity of 42, and a double click, you get a little brighter representation here, and it's a velocity of 84. You have 4 scenes down here for the sequencer to play. If you have this running, it's easier to see how it works. If you want to control these 4 scenes, I would suggest you use the sweep again on your expression pedal to this. Connecting my expression pedal, I can move through these like this. Any sort of note input you do in any of these 4 scenes will of course be affected by any scale filtering you're using as well. First of all, we have a root note that you can browse through like this if you want to. And we have 4 different categories here. We have a major, we have a minor, we have a chromatic, and we have a drum map. And for the major and the minor filtration, it's easy to understand this sequencer grid as a 2-octave system where the root note choice, whatever you've chosen here, is represented by these 3 brighter horizontal lines. It's not exactly the same with the chromatic choice, of course. Due to the limitations on the grid's actual structure, you can't fit 2 octaves inside of this grid right now. So for the chromatic representation, the root note choice is the middle line. And for the drum map, there is no changes with the root note. You can choose whatever you want here. It doesn't matter for the MIDI output actually. But this is just a heads up so that you have something to start with when you're diving into this. So on to the next, let's look at the shredder. So to help us understand the shredder, we probably need something like the sequencer, or I'm going to use my guitar as a MIDI input as well. So the shredder is very much like the sequencer in most respects. It looks the same, it has the same grid system, it has the same 4 scenes, and it has these filterings and the root note and whatnot. But it differs in a very important respect. It's not a player. This is in fact a modulator or modifier of incoming MIDI. So if you use a sequencer, you can modify whatever you put into the sequencer, or if you're using your own guitar, you can modify that. So I'm going to use my sequencer to play one long note now. And the shredder can come in and modify this. So I haven't yet engaged the shredder here, But once I do that, you'll hear this representation. So listen now. It might just be that you want to have this exact interpretation in time together with this transport that makes you want to use this shredder instead. It will do this obviously to multiple notes. So if you don't know how to play this kind of line with a -5 chord, now you do. Chromatic filtering. And of course I can blaze away in whatever speed I want. So let's say I want 100, 200s. Let's take 210. Yeah, so go ahead, impress your friends. Just realize that the shredder is a modifier, it's a manipulator of whatever is incoming from outside. So you can use the sequencer together with the shredder. I'm going to show you later on how to use the sequencer together with the drum machine. I can actually have the shredder behind the sequencer before the drum machine to add some small variations. Before going to the last part where I'm putting all this together, let's look at the Arpeggiator first here. The Arpeggiator is very much like the shredder in that it's a modifier of incoming MIDI. The Arpeggiator won't sound on its own in any sort of instrument. It's the complete opposite of the shredder in that the Arpeggiator needs a chord to be able to arpeggiate that chord or tone cluster. I'm going to use the sequencer again, but then I have to make the difference from before that I'll need at least 3 notes for it. The smallest amount might be 2 notes actually, so let's see what happens. And of course engaging the Arpeggiator. What I'm actually doing here is making a 5-note arpeggio out of 2 notes. The Arpeggiator is alternating between these 2 notes, building these 5-note arpeggios. I have a 5-note arpeggio here in the Arpeggiator. It chooses to interpret these incoming 3 notes in this particular way, that it's using this C, going to this F, to this B, and then adding another F and another B on top of that for these 2 top notes before it's going down again. So if we on the other hand choose for it to only use 3 notes, it's going to alternate between these 3 notes from C to F to B and back again, of course, as indicated. So what the Arpeggiator does is it splits up any chord, it arpeggiates any chord, but with some certain rule or principle. This scale filter will also decide what notes are inside of this arpeggio. So now it's not a diatonic interpretation of this grid anymore, it's chromatic. This is how you use the Arpeggiator. It's also a modifier, so put it behind any sequencer or, of course, your own input. I'll now go on to the advanced use of these, so you'll see how these can work together. So everything is not going to be that wild or that mad, but there are some interesting things in this. So I'm going to show you that by setting up some EzDrummer drums together with the sequencer and a shredder to begin with. This sequencer here, and I have a really basic drum groove going on. It sounds like this. As I told you before, the shredder is a modulator of the incoming MIDI from the sequencer. So it doesn't add anything new, but it alters any of the information in these previous MIDI inputs. So when I activate the shredder now, so you hear the ride right now. If I show you with another sequence here, potentially I can use some scenes from the shredder, right? Vary the output from the sequencer that way. Instead of me, while playing, having to go and click on the next scene and the next scene, I might want to automate these in some way. Use the modulator, open something like the sine. It's more controllable than the wobble, for instance, that is more of a randomizer in that sense. Here you have a nice clean curve. You can change the range of the scope of this curve as well, so I can have it only include, say, the first two scenes if I want to. So I'm gonna pull down on the max here until I see that it's only gonna alter between 0 and 1 here again. Now it's alternating between these two scenes. Let's say I control the shredder on the other hand with some sort of expression pedal. I'll just press my pedal and we come into these variations between these two scenes as add-ons or variations of the sequencer contents. You can also use a wobble and go into strike, for instance, on the actual drum machine. You'll get a variation in dynamics over and above these two velocity levels that you have in the sequencer. This is a super easy way to use the sequencer, the shredder and the modulator to get some organic variations to any boring drum groove you might come up with. Another thing that you can modulate, just connect a wobble to the tempo of the whole song. Introduce some sort of randomness, but don't go hog wild on the span of the BPM. I'm gonna go over to some more examples where you can use some other kinds of setups together with this sync to tempo stuff. So here's an example of why we really need something like the transport play button up here. Here I'm playing Dawson Cult. It's a really nice, little interesting synth. We have Pigments as well, I think, is running here in the background. But if I want to distress these a bit, I want to use some glitchy effects, say from something like stutter edit. I can introduce that into the chain. I'll just put those behind the instrument in any of the chains and introduce some glitch effects or whatever. But I need this to run, so listen to the difference. This is, for me, one of those great things that the transport play button actually facilitates. I can finally use stuff like Infiltrator or Stutter Edit or presets in Reason that needed some transport run to have them work. So all of the instruments and MIDI machines that you see here are undergoing changes all the time, so they might not look exactly like they do in the video, but the buttons are there and you know how to connect them and what buttons to press and what scenes are and stuff like this. And the best thing I could hope for is to leave you with an interest in at least exploring without some preconceived notions of what anything should be used with, because there really isn't any such ideas. I'll come back with more examples on how to use the loopers, for instance, but this have to be it for a first introduction. I hope this wasn't too long. Until next time, see ya. Bye.